Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Business as Usual podcast for January 2021. Just a few notes before we get started. I'm on my own this month because Mike's feeling a little bit under the weather and has done for the first couple of weeks of January. Obviously, this is late. We usually try and get them out at the start of the month, but with the country going into lockdown and with there being some uncertainty about what was going to happen with exams, we thought it was a good idea to sort of give it a couple of weeks, figure out what was actually happening before we spoke, because it was one of those where you kind of think, if we put this out straight away, it's going to be very quickly out of date. So this won't be as long as normal, obviously, because when you're on your own, you can't really have that kind of conversation. But I do want to make sure we hit sort of the key marks, the key things that we usually go through. So without further ado, let's get started. So in this month's episode, we're going to do a couple of key news headlines. We'll talk about exams, obviously. We'll talk about school being closed because you can't not. We will talk about the SWOT analysis in 5 minutes. That's going to be our topic for 5 minutes, and then we're going to do a student misconception of the month as well about about this misconception that businesses should always be looking to grow and get bigger. So before we look at some news stories, and I have got a few. Well, I've got one big news story, which is something I've obviously talked about a lot on here already. But before I get into that, it's worth just addressing the fact that we're in lockdown again, and schools are closed currently, though obviously operating remotely, and exams have been cancelled. We've been here before in the sense, I mean, certainly I have last year because we had this situation, but this one's different. And first things first. We've been in lockdown since the start of January. We don't know how long we're going to be in this situation for. At first it was kind of muted that we'd be back after February half term. I think that's very unrealistic, and I think that's very unlikely. I think we're going to be doing this remote learning for a little while longer than that, and I would hope that we'll be able to get back in by Easter and get back in front of students and get back in classrooms. What needs to happen for that to happen? Well, we need to get a better handle on this new sort of strain of the COVID virus. We need to get more people vaccinated, and it's spreading like crazy. I mean, as a 31-year-old man, know more people who've had coronavirus over the last 3 weeks than I knew over the first 10 months. So it is really important that we're doing things sensibly, but obviously there is an end in sight. But obviously we can't be too careful because, until we get to that end in sight, there are still a lot of people dying each day because of this. And so we need to make sure we sort of get it right before we go back. And in the meantime, we'll do our best with the remote learning. I'm sure every teacher feels the same. It is different and it's not as good. I'm not going to pretend that it is as good. You lose out on a lot of the discussion when you're on a Teams call. You lose out on a lot of the interaction with students, which I think is a really important part of teaching. And obviously to that end, the government have decided that it's not really fair to do exams there's a lot of students who will miss out on a lot of content. That was happening before Christmas, to be honest, because if you had to isolate for a couple of weeks, you were losing time. I mean, at no point did I actually at any point have the coronavirus, but I had to isolate on different occasions twice, and so ended up losing about 10 days of school because of isolation. Someone who had a positive test was in the classroom next door, and so our phones were close enough together that I got tagged on the app and had to miss a week. So it was never going to be fair, and I think this was probably always inevitable because you'd have some students in certain areas, especially areas where they've been more affected by COVID, who would have missed a lot of time. And it's not fair to ask them to go into these exams alongside, and it's not a competition obviously because everyone's you're competing against the exam paper. You're not competing against each other, but some people would have been disproportionately affected by school closures and what have you. Teacher illness and things like that. That it was probably inevitable that exams would have been cancelled. They have said that although exams have been cancelled, that teacher assessments will be used to grade students. And as far as I gather from what Gavin Williamson said the other day, it looks like he's going to encourage the exam boards to provide some sort of assessment resources to schools to help with that, which won't obviously be an exam, and it will be down to the teacher's discretion as to what parts of that they use and how they use it. But it does mean that then at least you know that the resources you're using are of a high quality and have been sort of vetted by an exam board and quality assured and everything. So, I mean, all I can really speak from is my plan. I plan on teaching as normal as best I can, and using my assessment structure as best I can as well, and making sure that ultimately, when it comes down to it, the grades that my school and I give our students are grades that our students will agree are fair. They'll be based around the assessments and the work that my students have done over the last year and over the last year and a half and 2 years by the end of the course. To try and, I mean, I said to my students last week when we talked about it on our Teams calls, at the end of the day, when they get their grade, I want them to look at their grade, and I want them to look at their grades over the course of the 2 years, but especially year 13, obviously, and the mocks that we do this year, and think, okay, fair enough, given the grades I've got, that's fair. And so I'm assuming that that's what every teacher will do. Moving on from that, big news story, which, over the last 4 years, I think we're all sick of talking about it, but it is important, and it's really, really important to business students. But Brexit has happened now. As of the 1st of January 2021, the UK is no longer in the EU Single Market and Customs Union, and it's having a significant impact on businesses. And I want to look at that a little bit, and I want to make sure that when I say, all of this, it's really difficult to talk about Brexit without making it political. I don't, it's happened. Whatever my personal opinions are, or anyone else's personal opinions, really don't matter. But as a business teacher and as business students, we've got to be aware of the impact that Brexit has on businesses, especially when you get towards, say, theme 4, for example, of the Edexcel specification, where there's lots to talk about globalization and protectionism, because Brexit effectively is born out of protectionism. And we've seen evidence of that with Jacob Rees-Mogg, which, I've put this as the news story just to kind of lighten it a little bit, because it is obviously ridiculous and laughable. But Jacob Rees-Mogg said this week that fish are happier now that they're in British waters. Better and happier, apparently. Yeah. I mean, what else can you say about that, really? There's been some controversy about that because one of the key industries, even though it makes up such a small percentage of our GDP and our employment, but one of the key industries in the Brexit talk was our fishing industry. And it looks like so far it's been a bit of a shaky start. There's a quote in here from the Commons leader, Tommy Shepherd, who says that boats have been confined to harbours, lorry loads of seafood is being destroyed because they're not able to actually get it out of the country and into these sort of export markets. And they reckon that the industry in itself is losing 1 million a day because firms are going bust. And all of this is because of the Brexit red tape. And so there are obviously going to be growing pains, and hopefully they'll get better. Hopefully, as time moves on, we will have more sort of clear practices set in place for a lot of these export markets. But certainly in the short term, it is proving to be an issue. To go a little bit further than that, there's a lot of small businesses are finding that they're being hit with new export charges. So when you export something to a foreign country, if you're part of a trading bloc, you typically get a free trade, which means that there are no tariffs and there are no quotas. And so as a result, it is supposed to be, obviously logistically it's a bit difficult, a little bit more difficult, a bit more expensive because you're sending things further. But the general rule is that it's supposed to be as easy as selling to someone within your own country. With obviously there's going to be currency changes and what have you. But according to reports so far in the first sort of 17 days of this new UK, there have been quite a few charges that I don't know if a lot of these businesses expected. So looking at this, an example here from Leon Paul, who is one of his company's part of the DTI's export champion community. So they've done obviously quite a lot to prepare for this. They've said that they've been hit by quite a few new charges that they weren't expecting. And the first is an export levy, which he reckons for his business is going to be 160,000 a year. And effectively, couriers are calling it a Brexit charge because there's an export fee of £4.50 for every parcel that is shipped to the EU. And that covers the cost of extra administration and form filling that couriers must carry out. There's a deferment account fee of £5 per parcel that covers couriers' cost of prepaying import charges in the destination country. And third, there's a disbursement charge, which is different for each EU country, but at least €14 per parcel, or it's calculated a percentage of the value of the goods. So obviously, the more expensive the good is, the more that fee is gonna be. And his perspective basically was that, and they do a lot of business with, it says here, almost a third of their 7 million annual turnover is to customers in EU countries. He reckons that small orders of anything under £100 they're just not gonna have a profit margin. And so, and the quote at the end, which says, "Jobs lost will be lost here. That's the reality. All of these fees will come straight off of profit margins." So it just goes to show that when you have a big political change like this, it has a big impact on businesses. I have a friend who works for one of my best friends works for a tea company, and part of his business is he manages the exports to Ireland, which previously was as straightforward as just putting something on the back of a lorry and letting it go. And I think he spent a lot of hours this week where he was just filling in paperwork that he never had to fill in before, just to get things across to Ireland. And so these are some of the challenges involved with the Brexit happening. There will hopefully be advantages as well, and hopefully a lot of these problems will be figured out as time goes on, and as sort of policy and paperwork can hopefully be shrunk a little bit, so that we can become a little bit more efficient. But it's clear to see that the immediate impact hasn't necessarily been that positive. So moving on, let's have a look at the SWOT analysis in 5 minutes. And a SWOT analysis is a key tool for business planning, and you'd quite often see a SWOT analysis being done. I mean, it should be something that's done fairly regularly, but more formally, you're probably more likely to see a SWOT analysis being carried out maybe when there's a new leader coming in, or when there's a need for a change in direction. And what it does is it's split into 2 parts, and I'm going to look at it into 2 parts. You've got the strengths and weaknesses, and then you've got the opportunities and the threats. And the strengths and weaknesses look at the past and present, like what is our current position, what's going well, what has gone well, and what has gone poorly, and where are we right now. So you're kind of looking backwards and looking at right now. And then the opportunities and threats section is where businesses will look forward and try and figure out what's going on in the future, or what potentially could go on in the future. So strengths and weaknesses, to start off, just some ideas of different things that businesses could consider when doing a SWOT analysis and looking at strengths and weaknesses. Think about things like, what do they have going for them? Do they have a unique selling point? Do they have a focus of differentiation and some feature that might allow them to be differentiated? Do they have operational advantages? Like, do they have highly skilled staff, or do they have production techniques that are unique to them and that make them very, very efficient? These are things that aren't necessarily always going to be the case, but they're the case now. And so as a result, it's effectively our advantages and disadvantages, our sort of benefits and weaknesses. Do they have any valuable assets? Do they have intellectual property? Do they have any powerful brands? Do they have any patents that are potentially valuable in helping them create that differentiation? Or do they have they got assets? Have they got assets that are worth a lot of money and that are productive and that are of a good quality? You've also got to think about the weaknesses, though, and all of those that I've mentioned so far could be weaknesses, but also think about, are there any areas in which your competitors are currently better? Not could be better, not necessarily were better, but are they better now than you or your business? And so in which areas are they better? Do they have more powerful brands? Do they have, that level of unique selling point that maybe you don't have? And also, are there any limitations in the resources that the business has? Do they have a lot of finance, and therefore are they able to use finance to help grow their business? Are they limited in terms of the staff that they've got? You could have poor leadership, you could have poorly skilled staff, you could have a lack of motivation or a poor culture. Any of those things could be perceived as obviously strengths if they're good, weaknesses if they're not. Looking forward, think about your opportunities and threats. So consider the following. Are the markets that you're operating in projected to grow or projected to decline? Are there new markets that are likely to appear in your sort of industry that you potentially could exploit, or potentially might get beaten to by other businesses in your market? Are there any political or legal changes that could happen, and would they have a positive impact or negative? And of course, they could be positive or negative. What are your competitors doing? As in, not what your competitors are now, right now. What are your competitors doing in the future? Are they launching new products? Are they developing existing products? Are they hitting new markets? In some cases, you might even find that some competitors are doing poorly. Certainly in the retail sector, there's quite a lot of examples of businesses that are kind of scaling back their operations due to the coronavirus pandemic. Are there trends changing in a way that might be a positive or a negative, especially if you're online in particular? That might be something that might benefit you currently. Has there been any media coverage that could potentially have an impact, positive or negative? What's your reputation like, and is that likely to improve or get worse? And I put the last one there. Are they expecting a global pandemic? Because it's clear that when something like that happens, the threat of something unforeseen, the threat of something that you could it'd be very difficult to prepare for, but that could happen, and you've obviously got to try and at least be aware of that. That's kind of what the whole scenario planning and planning for change sections of courses are about. Lastly, from this month's podcast, I want to talk about this misconception of the month, and it's something that I think, this came to my attention a little bit more presently because I was marking a mock exam that my students had done, and there was a topic on there about why should a business stay small. And I think there's probably a lot of students who think that businesses should always be looking to grow and get bigger, and I can understand that. I can understand that mentality. But in reality, it's not always the best idea. Certainly it depends on the objectives of the business and the objectives of the person owning the business. If your objective is profit maximization and growth, then obviously you're going to need to grow. But that might not be the case. The objective might be to, build a position within a market and solidify that position. And it might not actually be about getting bigger and making more and more profit. It might just be about fulfilling a social objective or, profit satisfying, making enough to live a good quality life. And so in circumstances like that, it might actually be beneficial to stay at a certain size and not overexpand your operations and take on more risk. Certainly, another thing to consider is, does the business target a niche market? And is the quality of their unique selling point or differentiation based around the level of service and the quality of service that they provide to their customers? Because if so, getting bigger actually can make that a lot more difficult. If you've got far more consumers and customers and clients that you're dealing with, the ability to give them the same level of quality service might be diminished. And so as a result, sometimes businesses want to remain small so that they can maintain control over the niche that they're operating within. So there's a variety of different reasons why it's not always the right idea to want to get bigger. Sometimes it is a good idea to stay at the size you're at. Survival is obviously the key objective for every business. Even big businesses, we've seen enough examples over the last few months on this podcast to know that not all businesses, big or small, are, guaranteed survival. So that's obviously a primary aim. But it could just be a case of, trying to weather the storm. Certainly at the moment, there'll be a lot of businesses, big businesses in the pub industry, in the restaurant industry, and in the entertainment industry, like cinemas and everything like that, and theatres. Their objective won't be to grow right now. Their objective will just be to survive and be there to sort of fight another day when the pandemic is over and things hopefully go back to normal. So I know it was a little bit shorter, but hopefully there was some interesting and valuable stuff in there. Thank you for watching. If you would like to download any of the resources, please visit our website, which is www.edifyed.co.uk/business. And make sure you remember to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at BusinessAUPod. And we will see you in February. Thank you very much.